Our next speaker is Brigitte. Brigitte Khair-Mountain is a senior strategic advisor, entrepreneur, policy analyst, and former UN official. Hi, Brigitte. Brigitte is a member of the UN Senior Women Talent Group, a member of the global roster of UN resident coordinators, a humanitarian, development, and social entrepreneurship expert. Brigitte has over 25 years of work experience with the UN and NGOs, as well as a series of ESG advisory roles for governments, ultra-high net worth individuals, royal families, and the private sector. Welcome, Brigitte. The floor is yours. You have a speaker. Did they put a...
No.
Okay, so you can use this one. Yeah,
this or this?
It's up to you. If you want to move, you can use this.
Okay. Hi, everyone, and thanks for those who stayed so late. I particularly like that, to have, because these are the committed individuals that stay so late. I will start my presentation basically to go up to 30,000 feet and talk about the multilateral system. And as a practitioner in that system for so many years, there is a sobering thought that the multilateral system for humanitarian and development aid is half the budget of New York State. So let's not get too excited about what we can do and how much of an impact we can have with such little money. So the need for data science is to prioritize, is to model, is to mitigate, and to predict. We have something that always interested me a lot is to see the models of what really worked around the world and how, when there is a will, things do happen. Global collaboration, what happened in the latest pandemic, and a number of our colleagues today talked about what happened during COVID when the whole world stopped, and we worked together to aggregate the data and to try and get a picture of what was happening to our world. One thing that we always think in the UN that works super well is airline travel. Airline travel, every time there is an accident, every time there is a problem with anything, we get the data, we analyze it, we correct, and then we try to predict. So from all the air travel controllers everywhere, that from one beam to another, when flights happen, to try and manage accident incidents, we have a very good operating system. The other one is seafaring, and of course what happened recently in the logistics crisis following COVID, we see that there is a very well-functioning global system for shipping. Telecoms and satellites, we also work together and we aggregate data and we work on that data, and that system seems to work, as well as the space system, the International Space Station, where many countries work together, and every time there is an accident, lately with SpaceX, we learn, we gather the data, and then we improve. So, who does what? Well, usually it is the multilateral organizations that are entrusted with aggregating the data globally. The World Bank was one of the pioneers in open data sourcing and in the democratization of data. We started seeing that data is not proprietary, and the more data you have, you're encouraged to share rather than hoard. I have worked in the UN for many years, and one of the things that I've started in Lebanon actually in a best practice program, and what fascinated me is knowledge management. It is a principle that was started in British Petroleum actually. That's one company that excelled at knowledge management, and that skill came to the UN, and we started adopting it in UNITAR and in other learning organizations. UNDP championed knowledge management, but we're still behind the curve. We're still behind the curve because a huge organization like the UN and all the international NGOs, I'm not talking about a bilateral system of government to government aid, I'm talking about the multilateral system. They're always behind the curve adopting new technology. they're very wary of anything new, and they seem to be set in their ways. They're like a big oil tanker. It's very hard for them to move quickly. So they move inch by painful inch. So adopting technology, until very recently in the UN, you had to, COVID, thankfully, erased that, but you had to give your ticket stub to get your travel claim. And a lot of people were using phones, so we can't even produce a ticket stub. And this is how backwards in technology they are. And this is a fact of life. So right now, there are pressing issues like climate change, like all the climate crisis that is forcing organizations like UNOSAT, WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, UTI and others to actually, and we've seen a number of colleagues, and there will be others today and tomorrow, who are talking about the use of data to solve and to try and model and predict global problems. So in natural disasters, we aggregate, the colleagues that just preceded me, they were talking about epidemiological data that is aggregated in epidemics, and they talked about the cholera epidemic. What usually happens in disasters, and this is what happens in Philippines, what happens in hurricanes in the US, they actually aggregate data from SMS and from WhatsApp and from Facebook, where people declare themselves safe. They sort of, and I'm talking here as a non-technical person, I'm a practitioner from the field, and what my evaluation is from really zooming out and seeing how things worked well and what are the impediments to the system not working well, and venturing to give you 2 or 3 solutions that we think as practitioners would be the way forward. The complex emergencies and natural disasters, what's happening in Sudan is a complex emergency. What's happening, for example, in floods, and these are, what happened in Turkey is a natural disaster. So the difference between the two, in complex emergencies, there are people movements, and it was somebody like George Clooney, who's very famous, who started the idea of using satellites to actually map the movements of people in Sudan at the time when there were the troubles in the Nuba Mountains. So this was the first sort of venture into trying to map where the displaced people are, because there are no ways of communicating with them, and this is when the UN started to adopt technology like drones and satellites to map people movements. In the last decade, data analytics for responsive disaster management, it has advanced since the big tsunami in Asia, where predictive technology started being set. It used to be in the Pacific Ocean because Japan has more means. It's a rich country. They did have that in Japan and in the Pacific Ocean. In the Indian Ocean, where the disaster struck, not so much. In the corporate world, a lot of companies started wanting to aggregate data because they wanted to predict what could happen to their businesses, to have business continuity plans, and to protect their own employees. As we said, social media is a very powerful tool. We saw that being used in Hong Kong, in Iran, in a number of conflicts that were happening on the ground. You see that social media took precedence over any other outlet to see the data of where people were going, what was happening on the ground. One of the things that is dangerous is what just was talked about previous to my talk is about the misinformation and also the gaps in information, which would be a very dangerous thing. In crisis, people get the information from wherever they can because that's life-saving. And if the information is faulty, like what happened with the vaccine, misinformation, and when there are faulty information, for example, when I worked in Iraq at the time after the invasion in 2003, I was posted in the south, and there were a lot of carpet bombing in the south. So whenever we went, this was just to give you a practical use of when you share data as far as possible and as wide as possible to try and save lives. Every time we went to a new town and we see that there is an unexploded ordnance or there were still minefields, that we're told by the locals, what we do is we raise this up So we have the GPS, we had Soraya phones, we use the GPS, we send them to our security official, and our security official will then give it to the radio. There is a public radio that was installed by the coalition forces, so people know that in this school or in this village there is an unexploded ordnance, and these were life-saving measures on a rudimentary scale where you have to actually do what you can with what you have. Well, public and multilateral agencies and NGOs should really increase data literacy. And here I'm talking also as a non-practitioner, and I'm not a data scientist at all. But what we want to see from our side as people, and people living in danger zones, people living in disaster-prone areas, is we want agencies to collaborate horizontally so that they can share the data and have open source data. And this idea of democratization of data is extremely important for the purposes of saving lives and for a prevention of loss of life and limb due to emergencies. The silos. Silos is something everybody who worked in the multilateral sector will tell you this is one of the biggest pains that will ever happen or has ever happened. It is a very intractable problem where a group of donor countries with special interests will come and they will dictate where the money goes. So the money is earmarked, and the agencies that are operating like the silos of our ports, so UNICEF, UNHCR, WFP, they all compete for the same funds from the same donors. So they will do anything to actually get this funding, and the donors control the agenda. So basically, if you go to any of the talks that they have in Sussex with the Institute of Development Science, they can tell you that this is the neo-colonialism, and here I'm being controversial, but it is an agenda that is decided by a few people who represent donor countries of the OECD, and whenever you need a collaboration, you see that this is not possible because it starts at the top, and at the top people compete. So these are like racehorses, and whoever wins will get the bigger pot. It's as simple as it is, coming from somebody who has worked in the system. So because of these silos, what you see is there is no collaboration. I'll give you one very easy example. There is somebody who worked in Geneva. He embezzled $4 million from donor funding, mainly Norwegian and Swiss. He was let go of the organization, but then he sued them so that they can give him his passport back. He was the controller. He went and he applied to a job in the World Bank. Do you want to know what the job that he gets accepted for is? Because they didn't do any data. They didn't even ask for data from the previous employer because there is no horizontal talk at all. He was appointed as the director of ethics, just to give you an idea of how these things happen, and these things always happen, and they seem to recur because there is no data transfer, no data sharing, and nobody really talks to the other person because he's your enemy because you're competing for the same funds. What are the hiccups? The hiccups, well, usually you don't rock the boat in the UN or in any of the big organizations, because if you rock the boat, you are seen as the bad guy. And things are great as they are. We don't do things differently here. We do them the same way. So this is an impediment to data science and to data scientists who are trying to use the data available to try and make things better with only half of the budget of New York State for the whole world. You try to invent the wheel. In every project that comes, nobody reviews what happened before. There are reams of evaluation reports. They're sitting somewhere and nobody looks at them because nobody analyzes them. And this is where we should open all of that data to the world and to the institutions that really care. Institutions like OECD and others that can come and actually analyze the data, universities that can analyze the data and tell us what worked and what didn't, why it didn't work, and what can we do better in the future to be really effective and have impact, because what we are talking about is saving lives and livelihoods and building a good future and decent living for people. So resistance to change is endemic. I mean, there is so much money that is spent on consultants from outside that will come and evaluate year on year of what's happening. So much money is poured into that. Nobody even reads the report. Sometimes there are names. I mean, there's so much cut and paste that sometimes there are names of previous projects in the new report because really nobody cares and nobody reads. This is something, I mean, it's sobering, but this is the truth. A lot of organizations don't know what they know. So there is so much knowledge embedded in the organization. For example, an organization like UNDP that is present in every single country in the world. It's my mother organization. I started with UNDP, and I think it is one of the most fabulous organizations in principle. But does it know what it knows? It doesn't. Because there's no learning and there's no data analysis. As we said, silos are on every level, even to the small office here where they would fight each other. Oh, in Iraq, we used to have an hour's meeting every morning. It's called the security meeting. And half of the security meeting was parking spaces. Who has to have the best parking space in a place where we were being attacked, where, I mean, at least my car was attacked twice, where we were sort of a mob went into our compound, and eventually they bombed our compound when we had to pull out of Iraq. And half of the meeting would be on something so trivial and so unnecessary. Also, silos. So what happens is you have to inform policy, and this is what my colleagues before me talked about. I mean, you see what really works, where the data is, and then you get them to the policy, you get them to the executive board, you get them to the people who will actually do the change. This is not happening. And basically, this is most of the problems are the same. I will tell you about a hiccup example. My favorite one is the tilapia example because it's somebody I was married to who was in charge of that project, and I know firsthand the experience. It was in Nauru in the Pacific, and they decided that to build a lake, a freshwater lake, and to grow tilapia. So tilapia is a white fish that they wanted it as a source of protein. The project cost about $5 million. So they had the earth movers and the excavators. They built a freshwater lake, and they put tilapia in there. And they were growing tilapia as a source of protein. At the opening, my ex-husband was there. His name is Ross Mountain. He went there, and he opened the project. He opened the project, and nobody was clapping. Nobody wanted to get tilapia, and they were surprised. Nobody thought to ask the people if they ate tilapia. They didn't. It cost another $2 million to kill all the tilapia and to drain the lake because nobody was ever going to eat the tilapia, and they were reproducing at a speed. The other one, which is something that really happened, was in the Haiti earthquake. In the Haiti earthquake, when 200,000 people died, it was a disaster. People were flowing in. All of the donors were flying in water, food, shelter, tents, and nobody thought to ask the people what are their needs. So what happens is after 2 weeks of this, people were crying in the street. And what happened is these people are voodoo, and they had to pray for the people before being buried, or else they will burn in hell. This is their belief. But what happened is that thousands of people were being put in pits with lime on top of each other, and that was hurting them more than anything else that could have hurt them. Again, nobody thought to answer. There's data collection that should happen before every of these projects. But do you think anybody is learning from these things? We know them by mouth to ear, and we hear them from people who went in the field, but nobody is actually aggregating that data. We know that, for example, in Lebanon, there is data on refugees that is not being shared. For example, I know because I advised the Prime Minister for a while, and one thing that we asked from the UN is actually we need data on all the refugees that are present on Lebanese soil. It's our right to know the data. And they said, no, it's a security issue. We will not share the data. I mean, there are examples like this where it's beyond belief that there is data and it's not shared even with the proper authorities that should have the data. And another thing that I think is also an example is when there is a little impediment. Like, for example, in Africa, there was a teacher college during HIV, because I worked as, I managed the best practice department in UNAIDS. And one of the things, we used to collect all the best practices that, and this was a very good data sharing, because then we shared them with all it's called co-sponsoring agencies, which are 10 UN agencies and the World Bank and the Red Cross movement that actually shared that data to try and find good solutions to HIV AIDS problems. One of the examples, I'm giving you examples so that you can see how we can use data and how it can really impact the lives of people. We had a teacher college, because about 7 teachers were dying in Botswana every week from the HIV crisis. So there were so many people who wanted to be trained in a teacher training college to actually replace the teachers that were dying so quickly and so much. One of the things that was, I mean, there were thousands who were applying, but they couldn't, because what happened is that the old teacher college just needed new furniture, which is like beds, and for all of these coming from all around the country so that they can do the trainer college, they could not because of just the beds. So after 6 months of this and no teachers available to teach students, no donor could give the bed because they don't have a budget line of a bed, of how to provide beds. In the end, the Germans did it, but it took so long. And these are the things that usually, I mean, learnings that we can actually drive back up to the policymakers, which is what's not happening. One thing is that the UN is doing well, and the World Bank and IMF, is to bring these amazing IT specialists. I know a number of people that came in and worked on innovation in UNHCR. And you bring them in, and they're full of energy, and they're full of capacities, of brain capacity, and then you assimilate them into the bureaucracy, and then they leave, because the bureaucracy is so heavy that they are not given room to create. These are the problems. We think there are solutions. I mean, I think there are solutions. I do think that there should be an outside body that is not within the multilateral system that can actually work on the data and analyze it independently, and it should have separate funding so that it doesn't go into the silo game. The resistance to learn. I mean, for us to use the evaluations and the data collected, if donors tie it, like for example, now there's ESG score for every company. If the UN has a data analysis score for every project that is funded, I think that could be one way to incentivize learning. Organizations are required to publish the data and digitize all data so that it's accessed, and we would have an open data source of reams of really knowledge that we have that nobody is using. Bashing silos, I always say the same thing about silos, and inviting academics and researchers to come into all the UN agencies and the international NGOs. I mean, somebody like Oxfam, who's a leader in really data analysis and data science, could be amazing partners for research institutions to come and really learn, because we're talking about something as important as, I mean, it is, to me, it's very dear to my heart, which is development aid and humanitarian aid. I mean, there can't be anything more important for us than saving lives. Revolutionizing UN agencies, I mean, this is a pipe dream. I don't think it'll ever happen, but I think there are ways to have like parallel structures that is a bit revolutionized, that is with the times, that will use artificial intelligence. And I think there should be a yearly virtual conference, because we don't want to pay for people flying in everywhere, polluting the environment, and also being paid travel expenses with a very strict UN budget and international budget. So I think a virtual conference every year for data science and aid work should be done, and I hope it is organized every year. And this is how I will end this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brigitte. Very nice presentation. Okay, we'll take one question, and then we have our next speakers. One is joining virtually. Go ahead. Over there at the end. Brigitte is going to be a panelist in 30 minutes, so you can save questions to ask her in 30 minutes. She's going to be on a panel. So we're going to take the question at the end. Yeah.
It is a prototype, and I don't think it is, they took knowledge of information from Lebanon, and they are enforcing a program that is prototype to every country, and I have doubt it will work. It is more a comment, as I said. It's not a question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Brigitte.